We are now going to look at the finished product, which we are going to build on top of throughout this entire course. To ensure that we can focus on the important parts, which is jumping a little bit deeper into ASP.NET Core MVC, I've already pre-baked a couple of things. You won't have to add the domain project or infrastructure project yourself. All of the code that I go through in this course will be available in the Start Here and Completed folders for each module. Pause the video at any time and add the code that we are writing together, or jump into the finished solution to have a sneak peek at how this works. The domain project contains the representation for our data. The Globoticket application is an e-commerce website. Therefore, it's wise to have a customer, line item, a product, an order, and the cart. Let's take a look at the cart. This is a simple representation of what a cart is. It has an ID, a boolean that tells us if it's finalized or not. This essentially will allow us to store the items in the cart before the user is then finalizing this to produce an order. We also have the customer email and when the cart was initially created, as well as the line items that we want to have in our particular cart. The constructor is simply setting up the initial values that are required for this model to be instantiated, much like the other models will do as well. If we take a look at the line item, it has a line item ID, a quantity that determines how many products that you want to buy, an actual reference to the product and a product ID. Notice how this is virtual, just like the line items was earlier. This means that it could potentially be lazy loaded by the ORM that I'm going to introduce in just a bit. We could also take a look at an order. The idea is that when the cart is finalized, this produces an order with a unique order ID, a reference to the line items that you want to buy, a reference to the customer, as well as a date time for when this was created. I'm going to use SQLite, and SQLite doesn't support date-time offset, and therefore I have to use date-time for the created@. property. I will then have to ensure that all of my date times used throughout the application are always stored in UTC. As long as we keep this in mind, we won't really have any problems. Working properly with dates and times is a complex subject, even if it sounds simple, which is why I have a whole course on that subject. And then we also have a property that will compute the order total. It will look at the line items, summarize the price multiplied by the quantity, so that we don't have to do this elsewhere. You can take a look at the other models if you'd like to, but they're simply containers of some data. They represent what we are later going to show in our UI. Or rather, it represents what we are going to store in our database. Speaking of the database, if you take a look at the infrastructure project, there's a data folder that contains a Globomantics context file. This here is using Entity Framework Core to set up a DB set for all our different models from that other domain project. I'm simply setting this to store the data in a SQLite file, which will be stored along with our application. And why am I doing this, you might ask? Because this will make it simpler for you to run the application without having to set up SQL Server. You can also run the samples on other operating systems than Windows. Be careful. Don't store the connection string like I'm doing here in your code file. And for an enterprise-grade application, you probably want to use a more scalable database, such as SQL Server. But that's outside of the scope of this course. This is using Entity Framework migrations to create the database. It's going to have a couple of repositories, which are all going to be using the repository pattern. As an example, if we take a look at the cart repository, this will inherit from a generic repository of the cart model. It will implement the iCart repository so that we can mock this if we were to write tests. We're going to get to this when we introduce dependency injection in just a little while. This exposes a method to create or update an existing cart, with a product ID as well as a new quantity. We can grab a cart out of the database, we can add the product to the cart, and depending on if this is a new cart or not, we can either add or update. Now, we're not going to go through all of the code on how to introduce the repositories. It's good to know, though, that we have a repository for the cart, the customer, the order, and the product. This means that we could essentially now work with our database without having to know that it's using Entity Framework. This makes it easier to fake the implementations when we are then later writing some tests. There's also something called an iState repository, which we're going to use later on, but it's going to allow us to store the state of certain property values between different requests. With an understanding of the available domain objects and the way that we can interact with our database, let's run the application to see what we are going to produce. This here is the Globo Ticket application. I can click Add to Cart. This now added one element to the cart, and we can see the quantity in our cart overview, as well as in the top right corner. I can update that I want a couple of more tickets for this event. I can even copy the URL to my clipboard so that I could share this to other people that want to maybe buy the same type of tickets. I can finalize the order, and as I place this order, it's going to tell us thank you for the order. If we add another product to the cart, and then go back to the main page, it's going to show us a summary of what's in the cart. So this gives you an idea of what we are going to build throughout this course. Looking at the web application, we're going to work with areas, attributes, view components, constraints, controllers, filters, models, repositories, tag helpers, transformers, value providers, and all of the ways that you work with the views, as well as how to properly configure this application in our program.cs file. There's quite a lot that we are going to go through in this course. Some of it is going to be high level, where you can then go ahead and learn more in the documentation for each of the different pieces. And I always suggest that you consult the documentation when you are working with some of the more advanced topics. This will allow you to fully understand how all of these different parts work.